Good day to you all. My name is David Dhumbura. I'm a second year student at Africa University and I'm doing law. My presentation is on liability without fault under the law of Delict. The objectives of my presentation are that at the end of it, one should be able to understand what is liability without fault. One should understand the fault theory, and one should also know the characteristics of liability without fault. One should also know the types of cases found in both in common law and case law. In these cases, usually talk about damages or damages caused by humans, and also damages caused by animals. Thank you.
Yes, so we'll begin this is the liability without fault introduction. Liability can be defined as the state of being legally responsible for an act. Fault can be defined as legal blameworthiness and responsibility in law. It refers to both the actor's choice and the act or omission that comprises the physical elements and the mental statements of the defendant. Under equivalent action, the Zimbabwean law of delict fault is a requirement for liability. Taking into consideration the fault requirement, it must be proved that D caused the harm either intentionally or negligently. The fault element must be proven in all equivalent action. It should be noted that failure to specifically plead fault renders a declaration fatally defective as not disclosing a valid cause of action. However, it should be taken into consideration that in Zimbabwean law of delict, there is also liability without fault. This is all because there are also other requirements for liability other than fault, and these are there must be patrimonial loss to P, a person's patrimony being his or her property and finances wrongfully, which can be defined as a conduct from D informing an act or omission, and causation, which can be defined as a causal link between this conduct and the loss. The recognition of these requirements in Zimbabwean law of delict therefore makes it possible for liability without fault. This can be supported by the case of Reinhard Printers versus Adam and Company. The court stressed the need for proof of both wrongfulness and fault. D had wrongfully caused the eviction of P from premises it was leasing from D, but the court was not satisfied that there had been proof of fault on the part of D because he was under a misapprehension about the law, having relied upon the wrong advice of its legal practitioner. Liability without fault is a situation which the defendant is held liable for his actions even though intent is absent. One can note that cases of liability without fault require only actus reus without the mens rea. In cases of liability without fault, it is better to convict an innocent person than acquit or charge a guilty person. Then we go over the fault theory. In the past, if someone had committed a crime and caused damage, could be delictually liable only if there was fault found in their actions. This view of the basis of delictual liability can be regarded as the fault theory. This theory suggests that it is inconceivable that a wrongdoer should be held delictually liable if there is no sign of fault. The absolute acceptance of fault as the only basis for delictual liability accumulated in the famous German jurist Van Genn's statement that the fault theory is a perpetual truth. This view has traditionally also been accepted in South Africa, in South African law, where the law of delict is still firmly based on the principle of fault. Liability without fault can be justified when there is the creation of a high risk of damage. The advantages which the creator of the risk draws from his products, the greater degree of care occasioned by an increased liability, the possibility of transferring the risk by way of insurance to ensure the wrongdoer exercises control over his enterprise, and thus also the risk its weight and consideration of la- of falseness in general. In the points below, jurists have tried to explain how strict liability can be shown in liability without fault. Interest or profit theory can be explained as when a person acts in his or her own interest and causes harm to another. He or her faces the problems and disadvantages which his or her action bring. Thus, the perpetrator of a factory is someone who is active in his own economic interest must as calculatory or furthering his own interest also bear responsibility for the harm that this may cause to others. Therefore, he who reaps the benefits of an activity must also bear its losses. The jurisdiction of strict liability, as Van der Waals contends, unacceptable. In the first place, there is almost no human activity which cannot in one way or another be interpreted as being in the interest of the actor. This would mean that almost any conduct giving rise to damage could form the basis of liability without force. Secondary, if interest and benefits are restrictively defined as economic advantage only, it would mean in practice that the victim claim for compensation depends on whether the perpetrator activity such as railway undertaking is a profitable or not in absurd state of affairs. Then risk or damage theory can be best defined as when a person active activities create a consideration increasing the risk of danger, causing damage and increased potential for harm. There is sufficient jurisdiction for holding him liable for damages even in the absence of fault, whether an increase in risk considerable enough in a specific cases is difficult to ascertain. For these reasons, the danger theory has been subjected to much criticism. Van der Waals, however, points out that the question of whether the potential of risk has been increased enough will depend largely on the legal conviction of the community as reflected in legislation or case law. This theory provides a certification explanation for most of the instances of strict liability which are recognized in our law. Moreover, the utility and practical value of risk liability are emphasized by the Supreme Court of Appeal in relevant cases. Then these are then we got characteristics of liability without fault. Number one, fault is not required for liability in claims for compensation. Number two, vis major or the act of God and fault on the part of prejudiced person are generally recognized as defenses. Then number three, strict liability is usually put in use either by legislation or judicial pronouncement in cases involving activities which as a rule create extraordinary increases in the risk of harm to the community. In instances where strict liability has been imposed by legislation, the extent of the liability is usually calculated by fixing maximum amounts of compensation. Number five, in most cases, the ability without fault is restricted to damage to life and limb and property and therefore does not include the pure economic loss. Then, now we go at common and case law. So these are types of of damages which can be found in common and case law. So number one is damage caused by loss of stolen things. According to Roman Dutch law, if a stolen item disappear even due to circumstances that were not the thief's fault, the owner or any other party with a stake in the item could file a condicio lawsuit against the thief and seek damages. Simply said, the burglar assumed the risk of losing the item, making them strictly accountable. Our legislation continues to apply this section. Then the case which can be used is Chetty versus Italian Ceramics is a good example as it discusses the certain forms of wrongful conviction. What qualifies implementing an unauthorized delivery system and rolling out stock responsibility for whose usage. Rolling stocks does not count as using stock. Stock sales made through unauthorized distribution system are considered to be uses of goods not sufficiently closely or directly related to loss, nevertheless, for legal responsibility to follow. Then another is damages caused by owners of neighboring property. The term nuisance refers to any unreasonable use of property by one neighbor against the interest of another. In our legal system, the legal jurisdiction for culpability for nuisance-related damage is irrelevant. On the other hand, there is the argument that lawsuits for damages caused by nuisance are found on the plain principle, even though there is a presumption of fault, as stated in the seminal decision of Bloemfontein Town Council versus Wichter. Contrarily, judgment based on English law and common law authorities show that strict liability for annoyance exists. Then damage is caused by objects thrown, pulled, or falling out of or from a building. According to Roman law, the actual the efficies vel dx might be used to hold the building's occupant accountable for any damage resulting from someone yelling or pouring something out of the structure. Similar to this is an item was hung from or positioned in a building in such a way that it represented a hazard. The actual position will suspense might be brought against the occupant to seek a criminal fine. Although the latter action lost its criminal nature under Roman Dutch law, damages might still be sought under it if the subject fell and caused property damage or human harm. Both cases were distinguished by the fact that occupier fault was not prerequisite for responsibility. Actually, the position of a suspense is an action of an interdict which can be taken to, to stop the continuation of the hazard where anything has been put in a hazardous position or suspended over a building or over a public route, increasing the risk of injury. Damage to goods stored during shipping by by in and stable keepers. According to the proprietary edict, the notice Copandes et stabularis, which is still included into our legal system. Professional maritime carriers, innkeepers, and stable keepers are liable for damage to goods that are kept on their property. Only these major casus fortunes and damnum forteo may stop this activity. Then damage is caused by animals. If any animal is owned by or under the control of someone causes harm, the owner or possessor may be held criminally accountable for the following: Aquilian action. This is when an animal's owner or caretaker intentionally harms a person, such as by setting a vicious dog on them or recklessly permits harm to be done, such as negligently failing to control a vicious dog that bites someone on a public street. They are responsible for any resulting property damage. In case D is liable for any resulting loss of property, this lawsuit is applicable to all kinds of animals, both domesticated and wild. This typical legal ground for it is a negligent failure to manage an animal when it was reasonably foreseeable that doing so would injure P or his property. This can be supported by the case of Portwood versus Svamvur 1970, in which a dog was caught in a fence. P tried to rescue the animal and was beaten. The court awarded damages against the owner of the dog under the Aquilian action if if it found that the dog was a savage dog and the owner ought to have foreseen that it might bite an innocent person. The court held that the fact that The dog getting caught in the fence could not be regarded as a novice actor's intervenence, breaking this chain of causation. It was an immature event in the chain of causation, i.e., simply one of an infinite variety of situations which might cause a dog with a savage nature to bite an innocent person. The plaintiff's action in trying to release the dog could not be regarded as wholly unreasonable in the circumstance that the defendant had not proved that the plaintiff had been guilty of contributory negligence. The court did not decide on the alternative claim by the plaintiff under the Barbarian Action. The Barbarian Action or domesticated animals. These laws should solely target the individuals who was the animal's owner of the time the harm was inflicted. A possession or a controller who is not the owner is not guilty of the offense. So this can be supported by the case of Joyce versus Venter. In case P had been bitten by a fearsome watchdog trained to attack trespassers, injury suffered by a dog had been taught to act viciously as a guard dog was not covered by the Barbarian suit. The Barbarian's action was based on the idea that because domestic animals had long been influenced by humans, it is reasonable to expect that to behave in a certain way. This is inapplicable to the dog that has been taught to act aggressively. Pierre was aware of the dog's viciousness despite being warned to stay in the car. He did not so because he thought the dog was locked inside. The issue whether the dog owner was accountable for the occurrence emerged. Then there is the quasi preparing action wild animals. It is when an wild animal held in captivity as someone. This legal action may be taken in it can only be taken against the animal's owner at the time of the harm was done because of wild animal cannot be acting against species of wild animals if it harms a person. This action, unlike the preparing action, can be brought when the animal was operating accordance with the nature of its species. Yeah, so in the case that the defense against the offense include the following: these major cases for the P, a third party who was at fault of an incident or a P was present illegal. This can be noted in the case of Van de West, Susan, and Berger, where the High Court Berger instituted an action for damages based on actual defendants. He said that while Van West farm was pursued by a wild ostrich and in the course of the pursuit injured his agile stand. The High Court dismissed Van der Wethuizen's defense's provocation and absence of causation and found him liable. He appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal where Swan wrote the judgment of the court issues whether the provocation should be recognized as a defense to the action or that it should be whether Berger had provoked the animal into chasing him or that he had and had thrown a stone at it, whether the pursuit was the cause of the injury or that it was not Berger's flight had been interrupted by his falling to the ground and the ostrich at that point ceased to chase him. Berger had then gotten back to his feet, resumed running, stepped awkwardly and injured the tender. It is concurring judgment. Ponan J.A. noted that there was uncertainty as to whether the action was part of the South African law and endorsed the academic view that it might be time for a statute to be passed to govern this area. Edict concerning wild animals, Edictum de Ferris. This Roman law provision which is still recognized in contemporary law holds strictly accountable anyone who keeps a wild animal close to a public area. If the animals injure someone, it appears that the defense that can be made against preparing action can also be maintained against this action. Damage is caused by grazing animals, actual the pasture. Yeah, this is a strict liability claim that may be made by when these animals, typically cattle, sheep, or goats, stray onto peace property and cause harm by grazing damage to pastureland caused by the grazing. The grass is simply one type of loss for which compensation may be sought under this section. Damage to other plants and shrubs as well as standing crops as well as other plants and trees is also covered. This can be noted in the case of Bonya versus Matanda 2000. The actual departure, according to the court, is still an active feature of our legal system. The actual departure is applicable to the owner of land against the owner of the animals for the harm caused by them is one person's animal and water onto another person's land and damage it by grazing or trampling crops. The Bwanya case addresses potential objections to this course of action. Then nuisance. A person who permits his animals to produce a nuisance may be held liable under common law. Damages may be sought in the event that patrimonial loss has occurred. However, it is not such loss has occurred. Any interdict may be used to address some ongoing annoyance, such as barking dogs that are causing disturbance. In addition to the common law, there are a number of regulatory offences that have been different punishments that can be applied for creating a nuisance, such as permitting dogs to bark in incessantly. Then we go at strict liability under statute. We have already seen how severe responsibility for certain delict has been incorporated into the law of delict under the common law. The preparatory, the quasi-preparatory, ethic defense, and action the purchase actual the emphasis will dejectis and actual deposit will suspense and a few examples of this. The concept of regardless liability is a type of strict liability that holds employees severally accountable for the wrongs committed by their employees. This will this will be, this will become clearer as time goes on. In Zimbabwe, strict liability has been incorporated into a number of statutory measures. This includes strict liability for certain arms brought on by aircraft used for civil aviation and arms brought on by companies providing public passengers transportation. Section 70, Section 72 of the Civil Aviation Act 18(1) provides for the recovery of damages from the owners of an aircraft without proof of negligence where material loss or damage is caused to any person or property on the land or water by an aircraft while in flight taking off or landing, then B by a person in an article or a person falling from an aircraft while in flight taking off or landing. Then also have Section 38B of the Road Traffic Act provides for the compulsory no-fault liability insurance to cover death or injuries to passengers in public service vehicles. Then we have forms of two types of iniuria: unlawful deprivation of liberty and wrongful attachment of property are based on liability without blame. The above discussion covered the positive legal position with regard to these two kinds. This basis on the highest string liability is the only thing left to be discussed. The desperation for necessity or intent must be linked to the impact of English law, and it's unquestionable at odds with the common law foundation of Actio iniuriarum. This must be acknowledged upfront. However, there is a specific circumstance in certain circumstances that supports the departing from common law interpretations. Public employees frequently engaging in illegal attachment and deprivation of liberty. Therefore, there is complete inequity in the relationship between parties involved. Then we call it vicarious liability. Vicarious responsibility is a legal doctrine that holds one person accountable for the deeds of another. Vicarious liability is an exception for a general rule that the person who committed the wrongdoing should be held solely responsible for any harm it causes. It is necessary for there to be a specific type of relationship between the two parties and for the wrongdoing to be somehow tied to that relationship in order to hold one person accountable for the conduct committed by another. Principal agent relationship, master servant relationship, and partnership are typically instances of such relationships. Then there is doctrine. According to the doctrine of vicarious liability, an employee is responsible for all wrongdoings carried out by its employees who are not independent contractors when they were operating in the course of scope of their employment and relevant terms. It is not necessary to establish that the employee was at fault, for example, carelessly hiring an inadequate worker or by neglecting to give the worker the proper instructions, even though the employee was not aware of it or should have had reasonable suspicion that the employee would conduct wrong. The employer is nevertheless vicariously liable. The doctrine can be supported by the case of Marcia versus Sadomba. The employer was found to be vicariously accountable for the employee's action by the court. The employer never questioned the vicarious culpability at any point during the proceedings, despite the fact that P had not claimed it in the pleadings. Rationale for doctrine: Why why is the employer legally responsible for the wrongdoings of his or her employees? A variety of policy factors are at the center of the social policy that gave the rise to the theory. The doctrine is typically justified on the grounds that by instructing employees or engaging in activities, the employer runs the risk that the employees may cause harm to others and also has the ability to control the activities. The employee who employs either to advance his or her own economic interest should in fairness be placed under a corresponding liability for losses incurred in the course of enterprise. And then we go another case which is about that is the case of Kwatiringa versus Jaravaza. The court suggests that the idea of vicarious liability is supported by a strong social policy. Corporations and other large employers run a variety of operations with the help of workers. As long as an employee flaws are committed during the course of their job and fall under the purview of the employment, the employer is responsible for those faults. If they result in poor management of the employee's work, there is a limit regardless of policy consideration. An employer cannot be held responsible for wrongdoing of an employee who acts in their own best interest. An employee does not act in the course of his employment if it is purely for his or her own interest and objectives, is not related to the employer's activity, and is not under his or her authority. Then employee who is independent contractor. Independent contractors are liable for their own violation through vicarious liability. A person hired to perform work who is not subject to the control and direction of employer with with regard to how he performs the task is known as an independent contractor. A person who works as a servant is under the employee's authority and supervision, both in terms of tasks they perform and how they do them. It is more necessary to determine whether there is a right to control how the work is performed, and that is to determine whether the employee is currently using that right. Yeah, this can be supported by the case of Banda versus Gamegon. In this case, the court suggests that independent contractors are not subject to the vicarious liability to employers for wrongs of their works. Existence of a right of control over a person with regard to the manner in which his work is to be done determines whether that person is an employee or an independent contractor. A servant is a representative who works under the direction and under the supervision of his employer, whereas an independent contractor works for himself. A servant is someone who is hired to occasionally follow the employer's directions, and independent contractor, however, is someone who is hired to do a specific job but is freedom to choose how and when to complete it. The supervision and control test is standard examination. Control comprises of ability to choose what is to be done, how it should be done, what tools should be used to complete the task, and when does it be completed. When determine whether the right exists to a sufficient degree to make one party the master and the other his servant. All these features of control must be taken into account. Then there is cost of employment. It is enough that the employee committed the offence during regular work hours. The employer cannot be responsible if the employee acts only if his or her personal interest and outside the scope of their employment obligations. For instance, D hires someone to work on a vehicle assembly line, and that person steals from or assaults another employee while at work, you will not be held vicariously accountable. The same holds true even if the employer has given the employee permission to use property of the owner for his or her own purpose. For instance, if it given employer permission to borrow a bicycle to visit a sick friend during working hours, and employee rides carelessly and leaves someone while traveling to and from his friend's home. Once more, once more, the employee committed the offence outside the scope of his employment. The employer would not be liable if the employee engages in a conduct that is neither related to his or her employment duties and reasonably accelerate the effort to, even if the employee intends to benefit the employer rather than himself. In Ramsevere Cooperative versus Chemsave Manufacture, 1993, a truck guard who was employed to offload goods in absence of the driver released the brakes of the truck to allow it to run backwards to the offloading bay to allow the offloading of the goods. The truck collided with P's plant, causing severe damage. The car's employer was held liable. And there's deviation from course of employment in a number of judgments. It was decided that the concept of course of employment does not necessarily entail the vicarious liability is no longer present just because an employee deviates from that course due to social justice concerns. The court has to decide to take stance that a significant departure from the normal course of employment must occur before it will rule that the employee is no longer performing the duties of his or her employment. This can be supported by the case of North versus NPF. When P's car had been struck by another vehicle, the driver had strayed from the task at hand when the accident occurred in order to attend to personal matters. The court said that not, notwithstanding the minor deviation in time and location, the employer was nonetheless vicariously liable to P since it had basically impeded that the driver's ability to perform his or her obligation. The deviation was not such that it might be inferred that the driver had ceased performing his duties. Then there is disobeying instructions. When an employee is given instructions and disobeys them, it is crucial to determine whether the instructions actually limited and defined the employee's sphere of employment, whether they just intended to govern the employee's behavior within that sphere. If the former disobedience to orders will result in non-vicarious liability, whilst the latter could still result in vicarious liability being imposed. Munukwa versus Moderede case highlights that the directive solely controlled behavior inside the sphere. Due to D1, the bus driver's irresponsibility, P was hit in a bus accident. The driver worked part-time for D2. The bus crew who worked for D2 allowed D1 to operate the vehicle while carrying fare-paying passengers. D1 permission to operate the omnibus was undoubtedly given by a member of the bus crew who was doing his master's work in pursuit of his master's ends. Crimes committed by employees. Even if the employee also committed a crime, the employer may still hold accountable if the crime was done while the individual was working for the company. In Local Authority Permission Fund versus Munukwa, the court suggests that an employee theft behavior may subject the employer to a liability for the victim's losses. This question is whether the employee is given the employee responsible for the care of the stolen assets. If not, the theft would not have been related to his employment and the employer would not have been held vicariously accountable. Then claim by employer against employee. Inquest Cooperation Inquest Motor Corporation Ltd versus Nyamakura 2000, the judge ruled that in theory there is no reason why an employee who has suffered loss due to workers' irresponsible performance of their obligation should not be entitled to recover damages from the worker. An implied term of an employment contract is that the employee will use expertise and caution in carrying out his or her responsibility. Along with this, the employer must fulfill its obligation to offer all required help. However, it's possible that the employee assumes no responsibility and the employer would be judged to have assumed all risk if the person does not present themselves as having any special ability or skills. In the instance the employee did not show himself as having any unique abilities or qualities, P had determined that he was qualified for the job and had not established any oversight process to make sure that he performed his obligation. Instead of being negligent, the employee failure was the result of incompetence. The employer was responsible for its own bad luck. Delicts committed by by contractors. Vicarious, vicarious, vicarious responsibility for offences committed by independent contractors does not exist. In Bando versus Gomegon, the court held that the independent contractors are not subject to the vicarious liability of employees for the wrongs of their works. The existence of a right of control over a person with regard to the manner in which his work is to be done determines whether the person is an employee for an independent contractor. A servant is a representative who works under the direction and under the supervision of his employer, whereas an independent contractor works for himself. Liability for person not employed by defendant. In Mushonga versus Zinomwe, he had left a car in the parking lot of a hotel where a driver worked. With disapproval, the driver had driven the vehicle probably to a parking lot. He had hit his car while operating the vehicle, sued for these damages because the individual who had driven the automobile wasn't an employee or agent, hitting the cost and and extent of their employment to advance a business. The court dismissed the claim. PU were to provide evidence that she gave permission to the use of a car, that she was able to supervise the driver's behavior in order to hold the accountable. Vicarious liability of state. According to the State Liability Act, Chapter 8:14, the state is liable for any wrong committed by any servant of the state acting in his capacity and within the scope of his authority as such servant. As the Act puts in Section 2, any wrong committed by any servant of the state acting in his capacity within the scope of authority as such a servant. According to Section 3A of the Act, the nominal defendant may be the President, Vice President, Minister, or Deputy Minister of the relevant department, but he must be identified only by his official title rather than by names. According to Section 5, the state must be receive written notice intention to file a claim at least 60 days prior to the start of the proceedings. It should be emphasized that some laws provide immunity from the daily liability or provide unique processes for suing the state. If there are any such immunities of specific processes, the applicable statute should be carefully reviewed before taking legal actions against the state. Parents are often not held vicariously accountable for the wrongs committed by their minor children only if the parent was personally negligent in parenting accountably. In the event that a child utilizes a dangerous weapon like a gun in a way harms a third party, the person who failed to take reasonable precautions to prevent the child from obtaining it may be held accountable under the Herculean action in Godfrey Oz vs. Campbell and also Flowers vs. Towers cases. Spouses are not responsible for the wrong committed by other spouse regarding a husband, while regarding a husband and wife. See law change versus change. However, according to customary law, a father is responsible for misdeeds of any child under his custody. A spouse is not held vicariously accountable for the wrongs that their partner has committed. Vicarious liability for wrongful property attachment by sheriff and messenger of court. In Tendera vs. Harare City Council, the respondent had issued an execution warrant after obtaining a judgment against the debtor. The property was confiscated by the messenger of court, who proceeded to the address designated as the place for service. The debtor had left the property, which belonged to the appellant, who now lived there. The respondent was sued by the appellant for the expense and losses incurred, alleging negligence on the part of the respondent. The court messenger was not the target of this lawsuit. It was not proven that the messenger or the responder were negligent. According to Magistrate Court Chapter Court Act, Chapter 9, Chapter 7:10. The messenger of court is chosen by the Minister of Justice. He serves as a court executing agent and carries out duties assigned to him under the Act. He is therefore the court messenger rather than the judgment creditor's messenger. So in conclusion, one can know that liability without fault might be seen as fixing a mistake even though you might not be the one who caused it. One can also know that being held accountable for anything even though you didn't do anything wrong is referred to as liability without fault. Strict liability what is what we term this. For instance, even if you didn't intend for someone to get it, you are still liable if you own a hazardous animal and it attacks someone. Despite the fault principles continued dominating the law of delict, there are substantial signs that strict liability cases have been established and developed. Some common law strict liability cases are still recognized by Zimbabwean law, and new cases are also being established by the legislature and the court. So thank you guys. This is the end of my research on liability without fault under the law of delict.